Now, all of this, of course, has had really serious economic consequences. The US experienced last year the deepest recession in the post-war era, with a contraction in real GDP in the second quarter of last year of almost 30% at an annualized rate, as the Americans say. That was, of course, followed by a very strong rebound in economic activity, but one which has still left, as of the fourth quarter of last year, a very large gap between actual and potential GDP, and an unemployment rate that, although it's fallen significantly from the peak of almost 14% that was recorded in May and June last year, is nonetheless still at over 6%, quite high by historical standards. It's worth noting that despite the strong rebound in the level of economic activity and employment, the level of GDP as of the fourth quarter was still below the pre-pandemic peak. And in particular, the level of employment was substantially below in March, where it had been at the peak in February last year. And in particular, the proportion of Americans who are working remains more than 4 percentage points below where it was in February last year. And in marked contrast to almost every other advanced economy, that peak in February last year was still in turn very significantly lower than it had been at the peak in the late 1990s. In most other advanced economies, including Australia, just before the onset of the pandemic, the proportion of the population who had been in employment was at record highs, reflecting not only the ongoing increase in the participation of women, but also a significant increase in the participation of older age groups, people aged 60 or more, who in almost all advanced economies make up a bigger share of the overall population than they have ever done before. And as societies change, as the nature of work changes away from physically demanding jobs that most men did in the 40s, 50s, and 60s to more white-collar occupations, people aren't retiring as early as they used to do in previous decades. But America is very different in that, in part, importantly, because of the opioid epidemic that's devastated communities in the Midwest and the Northeast of the United States, rendering a significant proportion, particularly of the less well-educated male population, unable or unwilling to go to work. There's potentially enormous spare capacity in the US labour market, which may well take a considerable period of time to be fully utilised, if indeed it ever is. In a whole lot of ways, the recession that the US has been in since March last year has been very different from the typical garden variety US recession, of which America has had 11 since the end of the Second World War. This chart and the ones which follow show how the COVID-19 recession, which I've plotted in yellow, differs from the average of all the other recessions that the US has experienced since the mid-1940s. Now, of course, the blue lines, which show those average recessions, represent a synthesis of a whole lot of different episodes, and I don't want to suggest that the average recession has been as smooth as those charts would appear to imply. But nonetheless, you can see how much greater was the decline in real GDP during the second quarter of last year than it has on average been during previous recessions. You can see how much bigger the decline in employment was and how much sharper was the rise in unemployment, as well as, of course, the subsequent decline that has occurred since the peak in the northern summer of last year. And some of this, of course, reflects the highly unusual nature of the recession that the US is still starting to emerge from. Almost every recession in post-war US history, like in post-war Australian history, has been caused fundamentally by a period of interest rates being too high for too long, or alternatively, as was the case in 2008-9, by a financial crisis. There's really only one recession in the US's post-war experience that in any way resembles the most recent one, and that was the one that lasted in the first half of 1980, that was the result of the imposition of credit controls by the Carter administration that produced an abrupt decline in borrowing and spending, and hence in economic activity. And those credit controls were taken off pretty quickly once it was clear the damage they were causing. This recession, of course, was brought on by government measures imposed, albeit a bit reluctantly and haphazardly in the United States, on the movement and gathering of people in order to prevent the spread of the virus, and compounded probably by the actions people took of their own volition to reduce their chances of catching or indeed dying of what is a pretty nasty disease. So the underlying causes of the most recent recession were very different, and the impact it's had on various measures of economic activity were likewise very different. You get even more insights by digging into some of the details of the national accounts. For example, one of the unusual things about this recession in the United States, as it was in Australia, was that personal income actually went up. And that doesn't normally happen in recessions, because the defining characteristic of recessions is that people lose their jobs and hence lose their incomes, and they therefore can't spend as much. Well, people cut their spending by even more during the current recession than they have in previous ones, because they simply weren't able to spend because of restrictions on going out of their homes. On the other hand, to a much greater extent than in previous recessions, governments sought to offset the impact of people losing their jobs by throwing huge amounts of cash at them. The US didn't really adopt a wage subsidy scheme like Australia's JobKeeper or the furlough schemes that were implemented in the UK and in much of continental Europe. Instead, they made 3 large cash payments to a range of households in the summer of last year, and again in December this year, and most recently again in March under the Biden administration. And they were the main source of the spikes in personal disposable income that you can see there. But because incomes were supported by transfer payments, whilst people were prevented from spending as they might otherwise would, what we also saw unusually during the most recent recession, as we did in Australia too, was a spike in the personal saving rate to over 25% at its highest peak. And although that's since come down, it remains well above the level of personal saving during the average post-war recession. This recession was arguably the only one that didn't feature a collapse in the demand for housing. Because recessions in the US, as in Australia, are typically brought on by a period of high interest rates, which crunch the demand for housing, a downturn in housing is usually one of the first things that happens during a recession. It's usually one of the biggest drivers of that recession, and the recession often continues until the housing market has bottomed and housing activity has begun to turn up. The only reason there was any downturn in housing activity in the US during the most recent recession was, of course, because of the imposition of restrictions on building work being done. And as soon as they were lifted, demand for housing snapped back pretty quickly. So that's another aspect in which this recession was different. The collapse in corporate profits was much starker during the June and September quarters of last year. But once restrictions were lifted, profits bounced back pretty quickly. Likewise, the decline in business investment was initially more abrupt, but it didn't last nearly as long as declines in business investment typically do in recessions. Whereas, as I said before, housing investment is usually one of the first things to go down, and then one of the first things to start going up as the economy emerges from recession. Business investment is often the last thing to emerge from recession, and that probably hasn't been the case in this instance. Productivity, of course, fell very dramatically because of the drop in hours worked, as people were either furloughed or left work altogether. But as people have returned to work, it snapped back pretty quickly in contrast to the normal pattern of recessions. The other thing that's been really different about this recession, of course, has been the magnitude of the fiscal response. As in Australia and other advanced economies, budget deficits usually deteriorate during recessions, partly because as people lose jobs and business incomes falls, people and businesses pay less tax, but also because usually governments will do things by way of increased government spending or discretionary tax cuts that add to the deterioration in the budget deficit. But on this occasion, the spending increases in the form of cash payments to households, assistance to businesses, and various other government measures, along with temporary reductions in payroll tax in the United States, meant an enormous increase in the budget deficit to, at one point in the June quarter of last year, almost 30% of GDP at an annualized rate. And even though that's come back in the third and fourth quarters of last year to something in the teens as a percentage of GDP, as I'll show you in a moment, the budget deficit is likely to remain at historically elevated levels for probably at least another 2 years as a result of the programs that the Biden administration is now seeking to introduce.